This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted that Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam has joined me in conversation today. Now, one of the reasons, apart from his distinguished career in the Indian Armed Forces, it is very important to talk to Arjun Subramaniam at a moment like this, is because he's probably India's foremost military historian. Even as I look at him across the screen at the moment, I can see the two books of his that all of us have read. One of them, of course, is called India's Wars, which is his first book, and followed by a sequel called Full Spectrum, where he really takes us through the canvas of India's military thinking, gives historical perspectives, and helps us understand how India thinks about conflict. Now, when India stares at conflict once again after the dastardly terror attack in Pahalgam, Arjun Subramaniam can add real value to help us understand how India thinks about conflict, how the nature of this kind of conflict is changing around the world, and how we should respond not only as India's military forces, but also as the public square in India. Arjun Subramaniam, Dr. Arjun Subramaniam, actually, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Hindol, for having me on the show. And from now on, it's Arjun. So it makes it much easier. And I'm delighted to be on your show. And I think this, we are at the cusp of a very, very troubled period when it comes to national security. And I hope we are able to navigate this crisis as a responsible, restrained, and an assertive state.
Very well put. I'll begin by saying Dr. Subramaniam, and maybe I'll go to Arjun in a bit. But let me begin by asking you, Dr. Subramaniam, in your books, you give us a real historical perspective of how India thinks about conflict. And in fact, in the introduction of your second book, you make the point that one of the things that you've tried to do in your work as an academic, as a historian, is try to give us a perspective, a distinct perspective of conflict from a very Indian vantage point. Now, some people may argue, well, are there distinct vantage points of different countries because conflict is same around the world? But perhaps it's not. Perhaps you could begin there, sir.
So, I've always wondered that what is distinct or distinctive about Indian responses to the employment of force as an instrument of statecraft. So let's be very clear about one issue, that as a democracy, the instrument of force is an instrument of policy, and policy is determined by the elected representatives of the people, which is the government. And therefore, willy-nilly, there is a direct linkage between how governments think, how they act, and how they employ force as an instrument of statecraft. Now, having said that, I think after these many years of research, almost 12 years of research, I've arrived at a few key findings that I thought I must share with you upfront. The first is that India has emerged as a responsible and a restrained state when it comes to the employment of force. However, in terms of assertiveness and in terms of proactiveness, I think we fall short when it comes to not being hurt by adversaries. So adversaries have constantly been able to take us by surprise. They have hurt us initially significantly, but then the resilience of the Indian state has always ensured that we've been able to fight back, and we've been able to sort of perform fairly well on the battle space and come out of most conflicts with a fair amount of respect, restraint, and credit. So that, to my mind, is a broad canvas of how the Indian state has approached the instrument of force as an instrument of statecraft.
And yet there is a question that looms before us, isn't it? In Pulwama, Prime Minister Narendra Modi crossed a major red line, as it were, which many people thought would not be crossed because of the nuclear dynamics between the two countries. Now, I remember getting a message from a fellow scholar saying, well, there goes the stability-instability paradox, so to speak, the day the flights, the jets hurled over Pakistani skies. But in a sense, the Pakistanis reverted. And in their imagination, especially with what happened with Captain Abhinandan and all the issues there, in a sense, in the Pakistani narrative, they had got back at us.
Yeah.
Even though India feels that we, in a sense, showed them where the line is to be drawn, the Pakistanis believe that, well, we got back at them and we hit back hard. Now, this raises the question, which I must ask you, is our deterrence today as effective as we imagine it to be? Because there are many people who are beginning to ask that is India's deterrence really as strong as many people believe it to be?
Okay. To offer you a holistic perspective, it's a very pressing problem, and it has given me sleepless nights about where do we stand in terms of credibility of our deterrence. And that is why I want to take you back to the 90s. Look, in the 90s, several practitioners, particularly from the Indian Army, argued in the late 1990s and early 2000s, saying that, look, let's not get carried away by Pakistan's bluff of using the nuclear weapon at the drop of a hat. We do see an adequate window for limited punishment for us to inflict on Pakistan whenever they cross the line. And I think we will be able to control the escalatory ladder. But then India's political establishment did not want to go down that road because it felt that there was no margin for the escalatory ladder. And I think Kargil proved that there is margin for a limited conflict under a nuclear threshold. Similarly, after that, there have been several unheralded or unspoken of punitive actions that have taken place across the line of control. These two have not breached that escalatory ladder. And then we've had the Uri shallow cross-border strikes, and then we had Balakot. So, given our past, wherein we were extremely circumspect and hesitant to raise the stakes, I think both 2016 and 2019 allowed us to cross that Lakshman Rekha of imposing costs. Were those costs enough? Obviously, they were not enough, because if the costs inflicted by India on Pakistan after 2019 had been severe enough, 2025 would not have happened. So the answer to your question is that we have exploited that window below the nuclear threshold, but have we been able to impose deterrence on Pakistan? No, I'm afraid we have still some distance to go that way. And I think to some extent it has also got to do with the psyche of the Pakistani armed forces, which is willing to throw caution to wind and retaliate at the drop of a hat. So what one must understand is that the Pakistan military is a professional armed forces, and they do still operate with a certain amount of pride. They have a fair amount of technological parity when it comes to India, when it comes to a short, limited, and high intensity conflict. But when it comes to resilience and depth, I think that is where the Indians score significantly over Pakistan. To my mind, deterrence will only be ensured if the gap that we demonstrate between intent and capability is bridged. I hope you're getting this point of gap between intent, articulation, and capability.
I completely understand.
Presently, the gap between intent and articulation and capability is rather rather wide.
I'm going to ask you how we can fix this gap, but before that, I want to point out one small thing, and perhaps you could tell me what you think. Even before Pahalgam happened, there has been a consistent debate in the Indian press by scholars like, say, for instance, scholars debating very actively on whether India, for instance, should get a, Bharat Karnat believes that we should get a megaton bomb, just as an example, right? That, our deterrence is not as strong as it used to be. That's his argument. We have to really now go all out there and create the kind of, armaments that will give us deterrence, of course, not just and he's never really thinking about the Pakistanis, but really against China, right? There are others, of course, who feel that no, our deterrence actually is quite strong, and we should continue down the path, maybe we should tweak a little bit. I recently spoke to General Naravane, who said that, well, in this entire debate on should India's nuclear doctrine and posture change, this is not hard and fast rule at all, which I thought was very important. He said, if the need arises, there is no harm in the doctrine changing. Now, coming from him, I thought that was a very important statement. I wonder how you would react.
Oh, I would also concur but I would put it rather straightforwardly to say that I think India's nuclear doctrine has always been flexible. I mean to say we do articulate a no first use policy, right? But we also argue that we will ensure a massive second strike, right? And I don't think going down the road of producing a megaton bomb is going to in any way sort of change deterrence levels vis-a-vis Pakistan or vis-a-vis China. I think we do have a credible second strike capability. And I do think we have an arsenal that is adequate to cater to our national security strategy and our national security policy. We don't want to go down the road of embarking on a nuclear arms race in South Asia. But at the same time, I think we've been quite successful in maintaining adequately credible nuclear deterrence. I am more worried about the non-nuclear credibility of our deterrent. Which would permit us to hit frequently and hit hard in case those deterrence levels are breached.
One of the things that seems that the Pakistanis tend to throw in these discussions is, for instance, and this came up only a couple of days again, is that supposedly they are going to get the F-35 aircrafts from China, which in a sense they believe would heighten their, comprehensive air power. And since much of this might happen in an airborne sort of way, they have greater parity with us. Now, of course, in the past, before Pahalgam, many people had begun to argue that especially because of the kind of submarine power that we were displaying, you just mentioned second strike capability. That's why I'm mentioning that the kind of, nuclear powered submarines that we were beginning to sort of build and acquire, there was, the gap between us and Pakistan was becoming so vast in the naval domain that, that itself gave us a lot of legitimacy as far as deterrence is concerned. Now, some would believe that Pahalgam has dented that thought process. What do you think?
I don't think, you see, the thing is, I think we need to distinguish between the two. Pahalgam clearly is a dastardly terrorist act. Let's not relate it to nuclear deterrence, right? In terms of nuclear deterrence, I don't think the Pakistanis have any doubt in their mind that, notwithstanding their rhetoric, they stand hopelessly outgunned by India. Though, of course, if you go to SIPRI and those other magazines, they will say that the number of nuclear warheads that Pakistan has and that India are fairly well matched. But what you've got to understand is Pakistan's nuclear warhead are ranged against a geographical entity which is huge like India. Whereas India's nuclear arsenal is ranged against a country which is far smaller in size and depth. And, I don't know whether you read an article of mine in the Times of India recently wherein I argued for a strategic bomber. Now, and this is again a road that Bharat Karnad went down quite many years ago. And then actually he was ridiculed by a large section of even, I myself, over a decade ago, wrote a piece criticizing his argument for a strategic bomber. Whereas I myself now, 10 years down the road or 12 years down the road, realize that with China as the major adversary and with their strategic bomber force increasing rapidly, I think there is a case for a strategic bomber for us to be able to ensure some kind of a second strike capability and what you call beefing up what we call the nuclear triad, the land, the air, and the sea segment. So the maritime element is important, but it's just one element of the nuclear triad that you're talking about.
So then let's talk a little bit about why this problem exists, because one of the things a lot of people have rather cacophonously pointed out, especially after Pahalgam, is here is a country whom we outspend by about seven or eight times as far as military budget annually is concerned. And yet, because of various asymmetries, so to speak, they seem to still harbor this idea that they indeed are at parity with us. And indeed, in some senses at least, they believe they might even be able to supersede us in certain theaters. What is lacking? What are we not doing right?
So, firstly, I don't think there is any theater of operation in which Pakistan can hope to make any kind of headway. It is not, with a country like India now, it is not a question of Pakistan not making any headway. It is a question of how much of headway you can make. So now you've got to look at the terrain, and you've got to look at the theaters. So the first theater, let's start from the north. It is mountainous. It's very heavily trooped on both sides of the line of control. Any kind of physical progress on the ground is going to be very, very difficult. And, for any tangible progress to be made operationally in mountainous terrain, you need a superiority on the ground of 5:1. That is the kind of superiority that you need to be able to make lightning progress or significant progress. So what does one hope in a limited conflict, just a few kilometers here and there? So you start thinking, you start weighing the pros and cons. Is it worthwhile opening up such a large front when you know that the lie of the land, the population, the kind of terrain will not allow you to progress rapidly enough for you to tell Pakistan, look, we can sort of push you onto the back foot within X number of days. It's going to be a fair amount of attrition warfare across both the mountainous, the plains, and the only place wherein India has a significant advantage is in the desert, wherein we outnumber the Pakistanis increasingly, large armored forces. But are we really in an age where these kind of multi-front wars are an option anymore? Strategists will argue that look at what's happening in Ukraine. Russia has opened multiple fronts. The war has been going on for over 2.5 years. So let's not wish away the possibility of a large-scale conventional war. I agree. We need to be prepared for that. But every war has to be looked at in context of the geopolitics of that particular region. And therefore, what pans out in our scenario is that the best case scenario for India is to be able to carry out punitive military action. Punitive military action as a primary means of deterrence is something that we should be looking at. And with a secondary option of being prepared for a limited, high-intensity conventional conflict in maybe one or two, across one or two fronts. But nothing like 65 or 1971 is really imaginable in current times.
I want to ask you a question which is almost like a cultural question, but I do believe it's very important because I think you alluded to it also. You said that Pakistan was an extremely professional army, or Pakistani had an extremely professional army, and yet there is an element in their behavior which always has suggested a certain desperateness, so to speak. It's that old adage where, we used to say in international relations, the only country in the world which, negotiates putting a gun to its own head is Pakistan.
Yeah.
If you don't agree, we're going to shoot ourselves, so to speak. Now, there is some truth in that. In a sense, the Indian army or the Indian armed forces reacts very, very differently. Talk to me a little bit about how you see the culture of these two forces change over time and where are we today?
Oh, yes. So the Indian army is a professional army that is the instrument of a democratically elected state and which operates under the umbrella of responsibility and restraint. The Pakistan army is an army that has arisen out of a from the two nation theory. It has progressed from being an exclusively professional force to being a professional and radicalized force. And the reason why it behaves the way it does is three reasons. One is because the Pakistan army is the only army in the world that owns a state, and therefore it has to hang on to power come what may. And the only raison d'etre for hanging on to power is by constantly invoking the humiliation of 1971 and Kashmir to retain relevance. And that is what distinguishes the Indian army and the Pakistan army from the manner in which they think, they articulate themselves, and they operate on the ground. And in current circumstances, you need to look at it through a geopolitical lens too. So this image of the Pakistan army within Pakistan itself has taken a severe beating over the last 2.5 years since Asim Munir has assumed the post of as army chief, and that is because of the severe severe damage that is being inflicted on them by the Baloch rebels as well as by the Tehreek-e-Taliban. And so that myth of invincibility that Pakistan had along its western frontiers has been punctured by the Taliban and by the Baloch rebels, right? And now losing face for the Pakistan army is something which is tantamount to blasphemy for them. And therefore, the only option for them in the current situation was to shift focus from the Western Front to the Eastern Front with India. And I think that, to my mind, lies at the heart of why Pahalgam happened.
Let's talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, which is that the Pakistani army owns a state, because there is a nuclear dimension to this, if I may say so. And the reason for this is, while Pakistan and its politicians and its generals constantly talk about using the nuclear option, they say it so many times that sometimes one feels that they're trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. One of the reasons some strategists have argued that they're never going to do this is because of the kind of economic extraction the army and the armed forces and its, across the board, its top members extract from that country through the Fauji Foundation, through the Army Welfare Trust. They really own a vast network of companies that are really the biggest economic force in that country.
Absolutely.
So they own a conglomerate. Yeah. And any deep nuclear war or any tragic nuclear war will absolutely finish that.
Yep. I call it Pakistan's nuclear bluff. It continues to be a bluff, and one cannot underestimate what you just mentioned. You must have read Aisha Siddiqa's book on how they create a network of businesses. And very recently, I heard a talk by a renowned Pakistani economist who was lamenting on the hold that the Pakistani army has got on civil society, that sees them gradually choking Pakistan and siphoning off huge amounts into army coffers, while exacerbating the divide that exists within Pakistani society between the very, very rich and the have-nots. And so he was making a joke saying that the next time we get to $1.3 million of loan from the IMF, we'll use it to repay another loan partly, and the rest will go into the army coffers. So there are constituencies within Pakistan's civilian establishment which is extremely disillusioned with the army. But the point is that they are very far and few in number to be able to make any kind of impact on Pakistan's civil society, calling out the Pakistan Army's bluff in completely ruining the country.
I also want to go to the point that you just mentioned in the last answer about Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And you talked about how there was a desperate, urgent need to move the gaze, as it were, especially after that infamous train incident that happened with the Baloch Liberation Army, to the Eastern Front, so to speak, with India. Talk to me a little bit about your understanding of what's really going on in Balochistan, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And indeed, a lot of people now say that even Sindh is a bit restive. So, what's really going on, and how long do you think the Pakistani armed forces will be able to glue all of these things together?
Number one, I think the Pakistan army is not going to let go of. It has adequate amount of resources, and it has an adequate amount of capability in order to keep these secessionist forces at bay for a long, long time. The fact of the matter, what is important to understand is how much are they willing to bleed for that. And I think they are willing to bleed for that. I'm of the opinion that while they're going to continue to bleed along the Western Front, I don't think they're going to give in that easily. The next is that the Balochis are extremely unhappy with a whole lot of things. They are unhappy at not getting their share of resources based on the amount of extraction of resources from within Balochistan. They are unhappy with the Chinese. They are unhappy with the Chinese presence in the region, right? They are unhappy with. They are unhappy with a lot of things. They are unhappy with the lack of autonomy, the lack of having a voice in Islamabad. Similarly, the Tehrik-e-Taliban is a different animal altogether. It is extremely radicalized. It has links with the ISIS, and it has a very virulent kind of approach towards domination of a particular region, and they are willing to go to any extent. You see, I only hope at some point in time of the future the Tehrik-e-Taliban doesn't send in its fighters or somebody into Kashmir, which they don't. The Tehrik-e-Taliban does not identify with the Kashmir problem. The Tehrik-e-Taliban identifies with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and that is why all their forces are concentrated over there. And what aggravates issues is, I think Afghanistan is also restive in terms of the Durand line. They're not happy with the Durand line, and therefore the bonhomie between the Taliban in Kabul and the Pakistan army is a thing of the past. So I think this is a melting pot of problems that the Pakistan army faces on its Western Front.
This is a question that some people are beginning to ask, and I want to put to you. You know, of course, like many of us, that one of the problems in the Bangladesh army has been a particular kind of radicalization within some sections of the army. There are reports that suggest that even after the new interim government was formed, there was, in a sense, a coup attempt was about to happen, and then it was stalled. Certainly, Sheikh Hasina herself faced these issues. And of course, in Bangladesh's history, these issues have continuously festered right from the time Mujibur Rahman was assassinated. Now, in the recent list in the last few days, one of the key elements of this interim government, a group called Hifazat-e-Islam, has once again spoken about this idea that, well, if there's conflict between India and Pakistan, we should try and cut off the chicken's neck and so on and so forth. A lot has been debated on that idea, but I want to ask you, we already know, and you all also alluded in your answers about the radicalization inside the Pakistani army. Now that Bangladesh and Pakistan are increasingly trying to build some sort of a collaborative approach against India, how do you see this pan out? Because this seems quite, at the very least, very uneasy.
So, the first thing about cutting off the chicken's neck is preposterous. It is impossible. The second aspect is I want to offer a contrarian view to this, right? So, the radicalization or the radicalization of the Bangladesh army as compared to what it was when President Ziaur Rahman was there to what it is now, I think is significantly lower. And I think India's role in that has been significant because I've had the opportunity for many years to engage with senior officers from Bangladesh's armed forces at the National Defense College, right? And I think the Indian influence or the Indian impact on training and collaborative approach with the Bangladesh army has been fairly robust over the last several decades, right? And I think there is still immense respect for the Indian armed forces within Bangladesh's armed forces. And that is why, if you've seen, within all this chaos, I think the voices from the Bangladesh army, which actually rules the roost even in Bangladesh, have been quite restrained. Whenever things have been going out of hand, I think there have been signals from the army saying that no, please don't go down that road. What is going to happen in the future, I'm afraid I cannot speculate. But I'm only hoping that we are able to continue this collaborative approach with Bangladesh's armed forces, so that in the long run, Bangladesh does not go down the instability paradox and does not become unstable. That is what should be of paramount importance for India.
Let's talk a little bit as we come towards the end of this conversation. Let's talk a little bit about what we were discussing before we began recording this conversation, which was the nature of, as it were, the texture of narrative and propaganda about Islamist violence and jihad around the world. Now, for a period of time, whether it was the Charlie Hebdo murders, the killing of that school teacher, cars ramming into people, bomb blasts everywhere, there was a whole period of about a decade or so where the expression of Islamic jihad seemed to be entirely based on such chaotic things. Today, a lot of people are beginning to come to the conclusion that a new age is upon us, where propaganda has come to a level where it wants to take over institutions in countries. There is for instance, our British friends consistently mention the emergence of this, so-called Muslim voice in the last British elections, which is very problematic. In various other countries in Europe, we are seeing similar things. In UAE, analysts are beginning to say that whether it's the Muslim Relief Group in the US and many others, there is this coordinated effort to take over institutions. And with the Pahalgam issue, for the first time, there is this idea that perhaps there's a Hamas influence in at least POK too. And we know that for many years, these elements have been trying to connect Gaza and Kashmir to say that, well, this is this arc of oppression, so to speak. This propaganda, sir, if I may say so, is moving towards institutional capture in many parts of the world. Talk to me a little bit about how you see this.
So if you look at second and third generation warfare, it was all about capturing territory. Fourth and fifth generation warfare was all about maneuver. Not only maneuver on the ground, but maneuver in the air, maneuver in terms of the changing character of war and things like that. But sixth generation warfare is actually far more nuanced. And what you're talking about fits in beautifully in what academics today call sixth and seventh generation warfare, wherein subverting large swaths of population, subverting institutions, creating hidden armies, creating sleeper cells. These are all tools of the current generation of warfare. For example, I don't know whether you saw that episode of India Today in which Rajdeep Sardesai went around Jammu and Kashmir speaking to young people and went to that village, I keep forgetting, where there are about 30 or 40 Hindu couples, Hindu families that are living in harmony with Muslim families. And in that village, there is one, there was the house raised of one young guy who vanished from that village in 2017. Now, how do you think these guys vanish? Seemingly very good students, quiet guys, just vanish from sight because they've been radicalized through a very nuanced and sophisticated system of radicalization. And the thing is, with every generation of warfare, at least I'm talking about fifth and sixth generations of warfare, they are actually engineered and tailored to stay ahead of the state. The state will always be on the back foot, however sophisticated the state may be. The United States of America, with all its technological superiority and all the might of the state, may not have had a terror strike within its own geographical boundary, but it has suffered immensely the moment it leaves that geographical frontier. So let me put it this way: maybe these networks or these covert networks have realized that it's no point in wasting effort in trying to intrude into this very, very secure American ecosystem. Let them come out. And then we will look at their vulnerability. And that's exactly what happened in Iraq. That's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. So you're absolutely right that at every few years, you will find new methodologies that will ensure that you call them what you want. You call them non-state actor, you call them terrorists. They will always be ahead of the state. And they will use technology, they will use commercial off-the-shelf technology in a manner that would put nation states, on the back foot.
My last question then, we are in 2025. Once again, a dastardly attack has happened. After many decades, civilians have been targeted on Indian soil. We are facing all the things that we discussed through our conversation today. You have written definitive volumes about how India looks at conflict and warfare. Considering all that we have discussed today, how do you think India ought to approach warfare in the next couple of decades, which are going to be crucial? And I put to you, they're going to be crucial because one of the big things that people are trying to stall, at least according to me, is India getting to a safe $10 trillion economy. Because that opens up many possibilities, many gaps, and so on and so forth. It's going to be a hard road.
Yeah.
How should we, and considering that we're about 3 trillion now, we want to get to 10 trillion, it's going to be a difficult road ahead. How do you think we should look at conflict and reimagine the way we look at conflict?
Look, the nature of conflict remains practically permanent. It's the character that keeps changing. Right, the character of war keeps changing, and we must be nimble enough to catch that changing character of conflict from time to time. We have been a little slow in catching that changing character of conflict. We need to be as responsible and restrained as we've been in the past. But what we also need to do is to figure out as to how, with this continued responsibility and restraint, we can walk down the road of deterrence, punishment, and credible coercive action as a means of protecting ourselves from terrorism. So, and I'd mentioned that earlier. I see only one way of doing that, and that is by reducing the gap between what we articulate, what we intend doing, and the capability that we build to be able to do it. I'm not saying that go down the road like X nation or Y nation. We need to develop a response strategy to emerging national security challenges that fit into the DNA of the Indian mind or the Indian state. And we must be proud of the DNA that we have and not be apologetic. Yeah, by all means, learn from our mistakes. But I don't think we need to be apologetic. But yes, we need to learn from our mistakes and ensure that they don't recur.
Tempted, of course, to ask you in detail about this, but I think we're going to be responsible considering the time that you and I are talking in. We are taking the responsibility of not discussing in detail what India's responses in real terms could be. Yeah. But let this conflict get over in a sense. I'm sure there will be an opportunity, Dr. Subramaniam, to come back and talk to you a little more in detail about some of these options once this crisis is over. But thank you very much. Thanks a lot for being on Global Order. Thank you for talking to us, and no doubt we will see many more books from you helping us understand India's response to conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hindol, for having me on the show. And it really was a freewheeling discussion, as you had mentioned yesterday. And it's always good to do a freewheeling rather than a programmed and sort of agenda-driven discussion. Yeah,
it helps that we are not a news channel, sir.
Yep, absolutely. Take care.
And thank you very much.
Have a good evening.
Yeah. Good evening.